Great. Now we're going to the question part. So again, ask the question about it. And we will be able to answer for your comment and then we will know.
Rebecca, then we will. Hang on. I think so. What? Alright, that's problematic. I think. Yeah. That's you.
Can everyone read and hear the question? Yes? Okay. So the question's about inner speech. I assume you've been able to read it. First of all, the term inner speech is misleading. What we call inner speech is in fact externalized speech. So when you take the sentence, the example I gave, which book did he read? In inner speech, you speak to yourself, you say, which book did he read? Not which book did he read, which book, which is what the internal language is producing. We have very strong evidence for that. If you have a sentence like, which boys did the girls expect to meet each other? It's the boys who are meeting each other, even though it can be arbitrarily remote. It's because what you're hearing is what the internal language is presenting to the mind is which boys did the girls expect which boys to meet each other. Okay, but you have no way of introspecting into that. You can only discover that the way you discover how your visual system works, or to take the other example I gave, the enteric nervous system. Humans have two huge nervous systems. One is up here, one is down in the gut. They have a huge number of neurons. They function the same way. The only difference is that in the case of the crucial difference is that in the case of the brain nervous system, we sometimes get bits and pieces of evidence, fragments from introspection. The other, we don't, there's no introspection into it. But going back to the question, it means it really can't be raised because we know nothing except from what we discover from the outside about our thought processes. We don't know how they work. All we know is little bits of fragments that we get from the, that happen to filter through to consciousness. And in fact, if you really introspect, when you, what we call inner speech is actually just fragments. And think about it, when you're thinking to yourself, a word comes to mind, another word, something else. You could formulate it as a sentence, but that's not the way it comes to your mind. Just bits and pieces of fragments of whatever's going on internally. So Einstein couldn't describe his thought processes because he has no idea what they were. And the same is true with all the rest of us. What we get, what we're conscious and aware of is some fragments coming from whatever internal processes are going on. And in fact, the study of language gives you plenty of examples of this. Just take the cases I mentioned. Many books are easy to steal from the library. There's no way to introspect about why that has a different meaning than many books were stolen from the library. You can introspect all you like, you're never going to find anything because the thought processes are inaccessible to introspection. So going back to the sentence, Einstein was no doubt describing something, but couldn't have been his thought processes, because those there's no way to introspect into. You have to study them from the outside. In this case, nobody knows how to do it. Down. Down, just down. Can you elaborate on what has to do with grammar? It's pretty straightforward. Grammar is the study of sentences. Discourse is the study of sequences of sentences that appear in a much longer system. They have totally different properties, totally different. All of the traditional millennial study of language is the study of sentence grammar. There are interesting questions you can ask about discourse, but they're modern questions and they have very different answers. I mean, take examples that have been presented in the literature. So one example that's been presented in the literature to argue that discourse and sentence grammar have the same properties is the example, famous example, the ship was sunk to collect the insurance. That sentence. The ship was sunk. The goal was to collect the insurance. The argument in the literature is that those have the same structure and interpretation, but they don't. If you say the ship was sunk to collect the insurance, it means that the agent of the sinking had the intention of collecting the insurance. It's not necessarily true in the discourse case. It's pragmatically natural, but not necessarily true. It could be the case, for example, that you have the real discourses like this. The ship was sunk. That's unfortunate because it means we can't collect the insurance because the insurance was only for damage, not sinking, even though the goal was to collect the insurance. Well, that's discourse. It's completely different from sentence grammar as soon as you look closely. There are a lot of things in the literature which are highly misleading about this. Functionalist. Well, there's a kind of a half debate between functionalists and generativists. One side in the debate doesn't take part, the generativists. There's a lot of functionalist literature about the alleged conflict between them. Can't imagine what the conflict is. I mean, there are a couple of articles by Fritz Niemeyer, by Howard Lasnik saying there's no possible conflict, just looking at different questions. It's complementary. I just don't see any issue. The functionalists apparently see an issue, but I don't understand what the issue is. Oh, well, I guess that was unclear. In the early 20s, from classical Greece and India up to the early 20th century, language was considered as a device for generating thought. Communication wasn't discussed. In the early 20th century, under behaviorist, structuralist pressures, language began to be thought of as a device that evolved for communicative purposes. I don't think there's any basis for that at all. It's a regression from the tradition And I think the tradition was correct. There's a language not only has cognitive functions, that's what it is. Language is virtually indistinguishable from thought. In fact, the tradition identified them. Language is what generates thought, thought's what's generated by language. Of course, it can be used for communication and many other things. It can be used just for expanding your own thoughts. In fact, if you think about it statistically, not that this means much, but almost no use of language is for communication. Almost all for other purposes, thinking, making friends, what's called sometimes phatic communication by Malinowski just means passing the time of day. You're standing with somebody in an elevator and you talk about the latest soccer game or something. That's not communication. It's just setting up personal relations. People find it very difficult to be in a closed situation with others and not to talk to them. It's kind of makes you feel uncomfortable, so you talk. But it's not communication in any serious sense. You don't care what the person's saying. So the idea that language is a device for communication is a modern, mistaken position connected with misunderstanding of Darwin. The effect of Darwinism was to lead a lot of people to think that language must have evolved from animal communication. That makes about as much sense as thinking that the language, the dance language of the bees emerged from human language. It's just different paths of evolution. They have nothing to do with each other. We're not more sophisticated apes. It's totally a mistake. Humans and apes diverged about 6 million years ago. They then evolved in separate directions. There's no connection between animal communication and human language. They don't have any, the properties are totally different. I should say that there's been a lot of efforts by mostly behaviorist oriented psychologists to try to teach something like language to an ape. The main project, the most important one, was the NIM project run by Herb Terrace. Herbert Terrace was a dedicated student of B.F. Skinner's. He thought it should be possible to, if you raise a chimpanzee in the same way that you raise a human, you should be able to develop something maybe more rudimentary like language. Totally predictably, the project, which went on for several years with very good people, it was a total failure. Poor Nim couldn't acquire anything. I mean, it's kind of like trying to raise a human to see if they could communicate as well as bees can. It's crazy. We're just not designed for that. Chimps are not designed for language. So, of course, you're not going to get anywhere. Of modern science, we do problem solving with inner speech is involved, but we use language for all sorts of things, to plan our activities, to solve a problem, all kinds of things. Those are all uses of language, but the design of language has nothing to do with them. As I said, if you just think about the nature of evolution, when the language system developed, probably pretty much along with Homo sapiens, modern humans, it developed in a way which had absolutely no concern for possible uses. I use my fingers for typing, and so do you, but that wasn't part of the concern of evolution when it evolved fingers. Things just doesn't work like that. These are serious errors based on misunderstanding of the way evolution works, of the way science is pursued. I think they have to be overcome. The question has to do with the origin of language. Ancient hominum gene, extensive insert. That's true. It doesn't suggest that they interacted and communicated with each other. It just means they mated, but that doesn't require communication. It may require some kind of communication, but nothing like language. There's plenty of examples of this. So yes, it's true that there was some interaction before language evolved. And if you look at, say, southern humans in the southern Mediterranean region, they have a certain they tend to have an admixture of Neanderthal genes. On the other hand, if you go into Africa, the origin of the human species, there's no interaction because there were no Neanderthals there, but they have the same language faculty. It's not any different. It's, so it just has nothing to do with the language faculty. It took place long before language evolved, maybe continued into the period when humans and Neanderthals were in the same habitations, which was true. Neanderthals lasted until 60, 70,000 years ago when there were humans around, but the language had already taken its final form long before then. Well, externalization, discourse properties we just don't know much about. As I said, they're commonly misinterpreted, like the example that I gave. We know a lot about externalization. In fact, almost all the linguistic work past and most of it in the present is concerned with externalization. Phonology, phonetics, what used to be called morphophonemics, so all of this is externalization. And a tremendous amount is about it. And it does have optimal conditions. Actually, my own work personally was in externalization for the first couple of decades of my linguistic work, things that it ultimately eventually, back since I was an undergraduate, and up till Sound Pattern of English with Morris Halley. And the main thing we were trying to show is that the externalization system takes the simplest possible form. Most of the work on evaluation procedures for grammar, almost all of it, is concerned externalization back to the late 1940s when I started working on it. It's all trying to find simplicity measures that would give an evaluation procedure for sentences. So I think we can expect to find that externalization is governed by optimality considerations, but very different ones from the internal language. As for discourse, there may be something, but so little is understood about it that it's hard to know where to look. Actually, even take Ian Roberts's work, which I mentioned, very important work, where he shows convincingly that a very wide variety of thousands of typologically different languages you can determine with very simple algorithms how a learner can move through the network of parameters to quickly hone into the ones that fix that language. That's an optimality procedure and a very striking one. So there's plenty of work there. Well, the question is, can the course of human history in the last couple 100,000 years, can it affect the I language, which probably arose pretty much along with humans? It's conceivable. There is a lot of speculation about this. That's in fact what's embodied in the famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that the nature of your language determines how you perceive and interpret things. That hypothesis has been investigated empirically for about 70 years now. Very little to show for it, only pretty superficial things. It seems that the I language is just fixed, doesn't vary, hasn't changed. It evolved in apparently a pretty simple way, maybe on the order of 200,000 years ago, before humans began to separate, and it just hasn't changed since. We have very strong evidence for that. I mean, it is apparently the case that any child anywhere in the world can learn any language with equal facility. We don't have, I mean, of course, it hasn't been tried in every possible case, but as far as these are things you don't do experiments with humans, but the natural experiments are pretty strongly indicate that. So it seems that there's no effect of socialization, different word order, any other properties on the internal system. In fact, many infants in many parts of the world, Denmark, the United States, are kind of unusual in this respect. The United States even more than Denmark. Like in the United States, most people learn basically one language or variants of one language, English. You don't hear other languages. But in many parts of the world, infants are exposed to half a dozen different languages when they grow up. Languages of very different types. And they don't even know they're different, and they learn them all with equal fluency. Don't even know they're different languages until maybe 4 or 5 years old. Just, this is the way you talk to your aunt, this is the way you talk to your mother, this is the way you talk to the kids on the street, and so on and so forth. They can be languages of great typological variety, but doesn't seem to have any effect. I think we should really think of language as being very much like the examples that I mentioned, the visual system or the gut brain. They're just systems that are fixed in Homo sapiens. There hasn't been enough time for them to have changed very much, and there's no indications of change. Very peripheral ones. Like there's some very limited evidence that speakers of the so-called click languages, the San languages, which seem to be the earliest ones that separated from other humans, maybe 150,000 years ago or so. There's some evidence of slight changes in the alveolar ridge and so on, connected with producing clicks, but it's all pretty marginal. The reconstruction stage. It's not that I language grows, it's that it appeared. So let's take a case from biology. Take the case I mentioned. All you have is microorganisms, bacteria, archaea, other similar microorganisms. That's most of the history of animal life. By accident, at one point, one microorganism happened to swallow another one, just accidentally. Well, that created a new system. there's a new system with a microorganism with another one inside it. What does nature do about this? It has to find a way of organizing this new system, following the general miracle creed. It finds the simplest solution. That's reconstruction. At another point in time, a cell happened to swallow another microorganism, that by accident, and that led to mitochondria, the energy system of the cell. So that's how we're all built ever since then. You look at the visual system, similar things. And by accident, some molecule entered a cell, and the molecule, so-called opsin molecule, had the ability to turn the light into electrical energy. That's why we see, that's why all visual systems develop. And that happens all through evolution. Accidents take place, the system gets reconstructed, we presume in the optimal fashion, to organize the new system that leads you to a new stage in evolution. Keeps going, you finally get from bacteria to humans, step by step in this process. But at each stage, there is no concern, zero, for how the system might be used. There's no evidence for it, for the natural processes are not taken into account. Later, you get variation in reproductive success. Well, that's natural selection, but that's the peripheral stage of evolution, and for humans in this area apparently never arose, either because we're just too recent or because the internal system of language and thought is so intricately designed that you just can't modify it. If you try to modify it, it falls apart. Like a ball of threads, you pull out one thread, it all goes apart. Maybe that's what it seems to look like. So that's the reconstruction stage. And once it takes place, in the case of language, it never changed, it seemed. Like there's no evidence that the language faculty of a child today is any different from what it was a couple 100,000 years ago, which is not a long time in evolutionary time. Does AI such as GPT have an I language? ChatGPT is what we should call high-tech plagiarism. It has no intellectual interest whatsoever, zero. Can tell you nothing about language or cognition. That's very elementary. The reason is very simple. The large language models, the deep learning methods that yield ChatGPT work just as well for impossible languages as for possible languages. So it's as if somebody proposed a new periodic table of elements, which included all the possible elements and all the impossible elements, and it didn't make any distinction among them. So that wouldn't be a contribution to chemistry. People would just laugh. That's ChatGPT. Can work for if you actually look at what it does, they're very clever, a lot of clever programming involved in the deep learning approaches. And what it does is scan astronomical amounts of data, finds regularities. The regularities allow it to, when you produce a sequence of words, to produce the next word with fairly high probability that that's the kind of word that would appear there based on the data. String it all together, it looks kind of coherent. Basically, that's ChatGPT. If you give it data from impossible languages, it'll do the same thing. So may be fun to play with. It's good PR for Silicon Valley. Maybe it'll perform some tasks someday that are useful. But right now, it seems to be useful mostly for students trying to cheat on their exams. Could be used for disinformation, for defamation, and maybe for answering questions. Nothing wrong with that. So as you can see, I don't hear very well. So I try to use live transcription when it's available on these talks. Well, live transcription works the same way. Basically brute force, massive study of tons of data, and it gets you some reasonable predictions. Nothing wrong with that. Technology, nothing wrong with bulldozers. Great, better than human activity. But as a contribution to science or understanding or cognition or language, it's basically zero. And notice, when you talk about a computer developing something, you shouldn't be misled. A computer is doing nothing. Computers, the only thing a computer can do is implement a program. That's what a computer is. It's an object that can implement a program. When you talk about a computer learning, you mean the program is learning. Well, what's a program? A program is just a theory written in a curious notation so that computers can implement it. So what you're really asking is, can we have a theory that can develop a theory of how language can be developed? That's linguistics. Yeah, tries to find such a theory. You could find such a theory. You could write it in notation, which a computer could implement, and the people would misleading say the computer's learning it. But the study of how a computer, that is a program, could develop our language is the study of language acquisition. That's it. Misleading discussion. Clarified if we want to understand areas. Seem to necessary, given that form sequence is illusionary. Well, it's not clear. There are reasons to think that it might be necessary to introduce pair merge in some fashion. Take, say, modification, like tall man. The phrase "man" functions as a noun, not as an adjective, which means that it's not just merging tall and man, but it's merging tall and man with a preference for man. That's basically pair merge. And the question is that necessary? Can it be eliminated in some fashion? Or do we have to introduce pair merge when we're going to develop a full theory of syntactic structure and the way it's interpreted at the conceptual intentional level? I think that remains an open question for today. The linguist William McGregor, afraid none. Sorry. Well, these are interesting questions. They're not really questions of linguistics. They're questions of power, colonialism in languages. Why is French the language used in West Africa or in Haiti. Why? Because France was a brutal, violent imperial power which destroyed these regions and imposed its language on the elites. So take, say, Haiti, which is an interesting case. Almost all the population speaks Creole. It's a separate language, but the elite speak French. Well, why? Just because of imperial violence. Why is English the language that's used internationally? Because of US power. Actually, it wasn't always true. Not very far back. I'll tell you an anecdote. Around 1970, I was at an international conference in Sweden. It was a pretty boring conference, so I decided to just take a walk in the street. Pretty quickly got lost, and I tried to find somebody who could tell me how to get back to where I had, but nobody spoke English. The only way we could communicate with each other was in kind of broken German, which both the Swedes could kind of understand and I could find nothing. If you walk on the streets of Stockholm now, everybody you meet speaks English. Well, it's just because of the expansion of US power in the world. If US power declines and Chinese power expands, you'll find Chinese being used as an international language. But, and I don't think that we should not speak of the evolution of human language because it doesn't take place. There is no evolution of human language as far as we know. As far as is understood, language appeared probably along with modern humans, and there's been no evolution since. As I said, you take any infant born today, they can acquire any language. There's just no evolutionary changes that have taken place except maybe very marginally in externalization systems, like shifts in the structure of the alveolar ridge and things like that, which are so marginal, not even worth talking about. So these are interesting questions, but they're questions about international politics, structures of power, how they influence each other and so on. I mean, there's a lot of concern today about endangered languages, indigenous languages that are disappearing. But we should be aware that the same thing is happening right on the European continent. Go to a place like Italy, which has been sort of late in developing its national system. There are plenty of Italians who can't talk to their grandmothers because they speak different languages. They're called dialects, but they're totally different languages, not mutually comprehensible. Well, as Italy is becoming more of a national entity, television spreading, education spreading, and so on, you get more the disappearance of the various languages. That's even true in the countries like the United States, which it's rare. I mean, I've been in places in Eastern Kentucky, the Appalachia, where you simply can't understand what people are saying in the streets. And at the university, they have courses in which they teach students English, meaning standard English, because they have to get a job at IBM someday. They're not going to be able to do it with their own dialect. In Europe, that was very common up till quite recently. Now it's much less common, but that's large language disappearance. Thanks. Very much. Pleasure to be with you. And since I won't understand anything, and have another talk coming up, I think I'll leave you right now. Thank you very much.
Okay. That's really okay. That's